My arms are tired. The little girl's desperate pleas echoed through the house day after day, but her stepmother remained unmoved by the child's suffering. No one could have predicted that those 4 simple words would catch the attention of a passing millionaire who was about to change everything. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The mansion stood silent, except for the rhythmic splash of water and the occasional whimper of a child. Taylor Coleman, just 6 years old, knelt on the cold, polished marble of her father's grand living room, her tiny hands raw and trembling as she washed her stepmother's feet. The basin of soapy water reflected the chandelier's glow, casting dancing lights across the girl's tear-streaked face. "Please, my arms are tired," Taylor whispered, her voice barely audible as she looked up at Vivian, who reclined on the plush velvet sofa. Vivian took another leisurely sip from her crystal wine glass, the red liquid catching the golden light from the chandelier. "Did I ask if you were tired?" she replied, her voice dripping with contempt. "Your father pays people thousands of dollars for spa treatments, and you should be grateful I'm letting you learn a useful skill." The young girl's shoulders slumped as she continued scrubbing. Her once bright eyes now carried a heaviness no child should know. The mansion, despite its grandeur with its imported furniture and priceless artwork, had become a prison of silent suffering since her father had remarried 6 months ago. "You missed a spot," Vivian snapped, pointing her manicured finger at her heel. "Do it again, and properly this time." Taylor's small hands shook harder as she reached for more soap. A tear dropped into the basin, creating ripples that distorted her reflection. The child's strawberry blonde hair, so like her mother's, hung limply around her face, unwashed for days despite the family's wealth. "I'm sorry," she murmured, rubbing her eyes with her wet wrist, leaving soap suds on her cheek. Vivian laughed coldly, the sound echoing through the cavernous room. "Your father thinks you're being cared for like a princess. If only he could see his precious daughter now." The mention of Jeremy Coleman made Taylor's heart ache with longing. Her father, consumed by his automotive empire, rarely saw what happened when he left for work. The child's world had shattered 3 years ago when Emma Coleman succumbed to cancer, leaving only fragments of memory. The scent of lavender, the warmth of a gentle hand stroking her hair, a soft voice singing lullabies. Now those memories were fading, replaced by days of servitude and nights of silent tears. Taylor scrubbed harder, her small fingers wrinkled from the water, hoping that if she pleased Vivian, perhaps she might receive a kind word or gentle touch. "Hurry up," the stepmother commanded, checking her expensive watch. "Your father will be home in 2 hours, and I need you out of sight by then." Taylor nodded, her thin shoulders hunched forward as she continued her task, clinging to the fading hope that tomorrow might somehow be different. The gleaming headquarters of Coleman Motors stood as a monument to Jeremy Coleman's success, but also to his absence from his daughter's life. Each morning, he would kiss Taylor's forehead before dawn, promising to return with a new toy or dress, as if material possessions could fill the void where a father should be. The automotive empire he had built from nothing now consumed every waking hour, a convenient distraction from the grief that had hollowed him since Emma's death 3 years ago. Just one more meeting, Jeremy would tell himself daily, scrolling through emails on his smartphone while Taylor's childhood slipped away unwitnessed. The CEO had convinced himself that providing financial security was enough, that the mansion, the private schooling, and the imported toys would somehow compensate for the empty chair at the dinner table. His office walls were lined with awards and automotive designs, yet not a single drawing made by his 6-year-old daughter. The pain of losing Emma had created a blind spot in Jeremy's vision. He can see the intricacies of engine designs and market projections with perfect clarity, but remained oblivious to the loneliness etched across his daughter's small face. The child psychologist he had briefly consulted had warned him that Taylor needed presence more than presence, but Jeremy had nodded politely before rushing to another conference call. 6 months earlier, in what he believed was a step toward healing, Jeremy had married Vivian. She had appeared at a charity gala, radiant in emerald silk, her laughter melodic and her eyes warm when she spoke of children. During their whirlwind courtship, Vivian had shown Taylor such tenderness, braiding her hair, reading bedtime stories, and wiping away tears with gentle fingers. The little girl had blossomed under this attention, and Jeremy had felt the weight lifting from his shoulders. She needs a mother, he had told Maria Lopez, their longtime housemaid, when announcing his engagement. Maria's concerned expression hadn't registered with him then. What Jeremy couldn't see was how Vivian transformed the moment his car disappeared down the driveway. The warm smiles vanished, replaced by cold commands. The gentle hands became harsh, pushing Taylor toward chores no child should perform. The sweet voice hardened into something sharp enough to cut through the little girl's fragile confidence. Each evening when Jeremy returned, Vivian would once again become the perfect stepmother, and Taylor, too frightened to speak up, would remain silent about the day's cruelties. The businessman who prided himself on seeing opportunities others missed was blind to the nightmare unfolding in his own home, all while believing he was giving his daughter everything she needed. The moment Jeremy Coleman's car disappeared down the driveway, Vivian's demeanor transformed completely. The sweet, caring stepmother act vanished, replaced by a cold, demanding tyrant. She sprawled across the plush living room sofa, one hand lazily swirling a crystal glass of red wine, while Taylor Coleman knelt on the hard marble floor before her. "Scrub harder, you useless child," Vivian snapped, nudging Taylor's small shoulder with her foot. "Those tiles won't clean themselves." Taylor's tiny hands were already red and raw from an hour of scrubbing. The cleaning solution stung the small cuts on her palms, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out. 6 years old and already learning that showing pain only made things worse. "I'm trying," Taylor whispered, her voice trembling as she pushed the brush across the floor with renewed effort. Vivian laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the mansion's vast living room. "You're trying? Is that what you call this pathetic display?" She leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her wineglass. "Do you think you're a princess in this house? That things will be handed to you on a silver platter just because your father owns a car company?" The little girl's shoulders slumped as she continued scrubbing, tears silently streaming down her cheeks and falling onto the tiles she'd just cleaned. "My arms are tired," Taylor finally admitted in a small voice. "Your arms are tired?" Vivian mocked, mimicking the child's tone. "Well, isn't that just heartbreaking? Perhaps I should call your father and tell him his precious daughter is too delicate for a little housework." Taylor's head shot up, eyes wide with fear. "No, please don't tell Daddy." "That's what I thought," the stepmother said with a cruel smile. "Nobody wants to hear a child cry about chores, especially not your father. He's busy running Coleman Motors, providing this beautiful home, these nice clothes." She gestured around the mansion with her wineglass. "The least you could do is earn your keep." Taylor nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her cheek. She returned to her scrubbing, small shoulders hunched in defeat. "And remember," Vivian added, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "your father won't believe you anyway. Who would he trust, his devoted new wife or a whining child who misses her mommy?" The mention of her mother made Taylor's heart ache even more. She scrubbed harder, her tiny hands raw and trembling. He had left an important meeting early, driven by an inexplicable urge to check on Taylor. What he saw froze him in place, his 6-year-old daughter kneeling on the polished marble, her tiny hands red and raw as she scrubbed Vivian's feet in a basin of soapy water. "What in God's name is happening here?" Jeremy's voice thundered through the cavernous living room, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. His face transformed from shock to fury in an instant, the veins in his neck visibly pulsing. Vivian's reaction was immediate and calculated. The cruel smile she had worn seconds earlier vanished, replaced by a mask of innocence and distress. Tears welled in her eyes as she pulled her feet from the water, reaching for Taylor with theatrical tenderness. "Darling, you're home early," she exclaimed, her voice trembling perfectly. Poor Taylor insisted on helping me. I told her she didn't have to, but she's such a sweet child. She dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. She said she wanted to be just like the princesses in her storybooks who helped their mothers. Taylor remained frozen, her small frame trembling, eyes downcast. When Jeremy approached, she flinched, a reaction that didn't escape his notice. The CEO knelt beside his daughter, gently lifting her chin to meet his gaze. The fear in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. "Taylor, sweetheart, is this true?" he asked softly. The child's eyes darted nervously toward Vivian, who maintained her performance but shot Taylor a warning glance that only Jeremy caught. Taylor remained silent, her lower lip quivering. Without another word, Jeremy scooped his daughter into his arms. She clung to him desperately, burying her face in his shoulder, tiny fingers gripping his suit jacket as if afraid he might disappear. "We'll discuss this later," he said to Vivian, his voice cold as steel. The warmth that had once colored his interactions with his wife had evaporated, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. As Jeremy carried Taylor upstairs, he felt her tears soaking through his shirt. His mind raced, piecing together small incidents he had dismissed over the past months. Unexplained bruises, Taylor's increasing silence, her reluctance to be left alone with Vivian. The successful businessman who prided himself on his perception had missed what was happening right under his roof. In his daughter's bedroom, surrounded by teddy bears and picture books, Jeremy's suspicion of Vivian crystallized into something hard and unforgiving. This was just the beginning of a storm that would soon engulf the entire Coleman household. The moonlight spilled through Taylor Coleman's bedroom window, casting long shadows across her pink canopy bed. The 6-year-old sat curled in a tight ball, her small fingers clutching the worn teddy bear that had been her mother's final gift. 3 years had passed since Emma's death, but the stuffed animal still carried faint traces of her perfume if Taylor pressed her nose against it hard enough. "I miss Mommy," she whispered to the bear, her voice trembling. "She never made my arms hurt." Taylor's tiny hands were still red and raw from the afternoon's ordeal. She stroked the bear's matted fur, finding comfort in its familiar texture. Would Mommy be mad at me for not being good enough for Vivian? Outside in the hallway, Jeremy Coleman paused, his hand hovering inches from his daughter's door. The image of Taylor kneeling on the floor, washing his wife's feet, had burned itself into his mind. Something felt deeply wrong, yet he couldn't quite grasp what was happening in his own home. The successful CEO of Coleman Motors could solve complex business problems, but felt utterly lost when it came to his daughter's sadness. Emma would have known what to do, he murmured to himself, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The mansion that had once been filled with laughter now seemed cavernous and cold, despite its luxury furnishings and expensive artwork. Jeremy leaned his forehead against the door, listening to Taylor's soft sobs. Inside, the child pressed her face into her pillow to muffle her crying. "I'll be better tomorrow," she promised her teddy bear. "Maybe if I'm really good, Vivian will like me." She tucked the stuffed animal under her chin, finding solace in its soft presence. It was the only thing that still connected her to the mother whose face was becoming increasingly difficult to remember. Jeremy's hand fell away from the doorknob. He told himself Taylor just needed time to adjust to her new stepmother. Perhaps tomorrow would be better. Perhaps Vivian was right, that his daughter was simply seeking attention. Perhaps his own grief was making him see problems where none existed. The wealthy businessman retreated down the hallway toward the master bedroom, where Vivian waited. The distance between father and daughter stretched far beyond the physical space between their rooms. In one wing of the mansion, a little girl cried herself to sleep, clutching her only true friend. In another, her father tried to convince himself that the family he had hastily rebuilt could somehow replace what they had lost. The grand house settled into silence, its expensive walls concealing the growing darkness within. For Taylor, this night marked just the beginning of her suffering. For Jeremy, it was the first missed opportunity of many to see the truth before his eyes. Morning sunlight streamed through the mansion's tall windows as Jeremy Coleman entered the dining room. The table was set with fine china and crystal glasses. A spread of fresh fruit, pastries, and a steaming pot of coffee arranged perfectly at the center. Vivian stood by the table, her hair immaculately styled, wearing a powder blue dress that complemented her practiced smile. "Good morning, darling," she cooed, pouring coffee into Jeremy's cup with theatrical grace. "I made your favorite breakfast. Taylor and I have been up early, haven't we, sweetie?" Taylor sat quietly in her chair, her small frame almost swallowed by the ornate furniture. The child's eyes were downcast, focused on the untouched food before her. When she glanced up at her father, her smile seemed forced. "Yes, Mommy," she whispered, the words sounding foreign on her tongue. Jeremy kissed the top of his daughter's head before taking his seat. "You two are getting along well, then?" "Wonderfully," Vivian replied, her voice dripping with sweetness as she took her place across from him. Beneath the polished mahogany table, hidden from Jeremy's view, Vivian's foot connected sharply with Taylor's shin. The little girl flinched violently, her spoon clattering against the china plate as it fell from her hand. "I'm sorry," Taylor blurted out, her voice trembling as she bent to retrieve the utensil from the floor. Jeremy frowned. "It's just a spoon, sweetheart. No need to apologize." "Taylor's just a bit clumsy this morning," Vivian interjected smoothly, passing a napkin to the child. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes flashed a warning. "Aren't you, dear?" The CEO of Coleman Motors watched the interaction with unease. Something felt off, but he couldn't quite place it. Was it normal for a child to be so jumpy? Perhaps Taylor was still adjusting to their new family dynamic. "How did you sleep?" Jeremy asked his daughter, trying to ease the tension. "Fine," Taylor answered, her voice barely audible as she carefully picked at her food. Vivian dominated the conversation that followed, discussing charity events and house renovations, while occasionally directing sidelong glances at Taylor that made the child shrink further into her chair. Jeremy nodded absently, his thoughts already drifting to the automotive empire waiting for him. The new electric vehicle prototype needed his approval, and investors were expecting quarterly projections by the end of the week. As he sipped his coffee, he convinced himself that Taylor and Vivian just needed more time together. After all, blending families wasn't supposed to be easy. "I should get going," he said finally, rising from the table. "Big meeting today." As he kissed Taylor goodbye, he missed the look of quiet desperation in her eyes. "I have some wonderful news," Vivian announced over breakfast, her voice dripping with honey as she placed a hand on Jeremy's shoulder. "Mother is coming to stay with us for a while. She'll be such a help with Taylor." Jeremy Coleman looked up from his newspaper, coffee cup suspended midway to his lips. "Your mother? I thought she lived in Florida." "She did, darling. But she's been so lonely since father passed." Vivian's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Besides, she adores children." Taylor sat quietly, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate. The 6-year-old hadn't eaten more than a few bites, her appetite diminished by the news. Later that afternoon, Margaret arrived with 3 designer suitcases and a scowl that deepened the moment she laid eyes on Taylor. The elderly woman's hair was dyed an unnatural shade of auburn, pinned back severely from her face, where heavy makeup attempted to mask deep wrinkles. "So this is the child," Margaret said, eyeing Taylor critically. "Rather small for her age, isn't she? Doesn't look like she'd be much help around the house. Jeremy placed a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. Taylor's only 6, Margaret. She's not meant to be help around the house. Margaret sniffed dismissively. Children need responsibilities. In my day, we were contributing to the household by age 4. During dinner, the tension was palpable. Taylor barely touched her food, her eyes downcast, except when she occasionally glanced at her father with silent pleas. Jeremy tried to engage his daughter in conversation, asking about her day and offering gentle smiles, but the child remained withdrawn. "Taylor, sweetheart, is everything all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Before Taylor could answer, Vivian interjected. "She's just shy around new people, aren't you, darling?" Her fingers gripped Taylor's arm under the table, pinching hard enough to make the girl wince. "Mother can be a bit blunt," Vivian explained to Jeremy, "but she means well. Taylor will warm up to her, won't you?" The child nodded automatically, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Jeremy sighed, glancing at his watch. "I have to review those production reports before tomorrow's meeting." He kissed Taylor's forehead. "Things will settle down soon, Princess. You'll see." As Jeremy retreated to his home office, Taylor watched him go, her small shoulders slumping. Margaret leaned across the table, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Your father is a very busy, important man," she said. "We mustn't bother him with silly little problems, must we?" Taylor shook her head, understanding the warning beneath the words. The CEO of Coleman Motors had left his daughter alone with 2 predators. Convincing himself that time would heal what attention could fix in an instant. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Coleman Motors, as Jeremy Coleman stared at the quarterly reports spread across his mahogany desk. His mind drifted from the automotive sales figures to Taylor's tearful face that morning. He rubbed his temples, trying to focus on the business that had made him millions, but his daughter's silent pleas kept interrupting his thoughts. "Sir, the board is waiting," his assistant reminded him, breaking his reverie. At the mansion, Taylor's small hands trembled as she polished the grand piano in the east wing. Margaret loomed over her like a shadow, arms crossed and lips pursed in perpetual disapproval. "You missed a spot," the elderly woman snapped, pointing a bony finger at an invisible smudge. "Your father pays for the best schools, and you can't even clean properly." The 6-year-old bit her lip and scrubbed harder, her reflection distorted in the gleaming black surface. Her arms ached from hours of cleaning, but she dared not complain. Earlier, when she'd accidentally dropped a duster, Margaret had made her stand in the corner for 20 minutes. "When I was your age, I was already helping with the cooking and laundry," Vivian's mother continued, checking her watch. "Hurry up. You still have the hallway floors to do before dinner." In another part of the mansion, Maria Lopez passed by on her way to collect her final paycheck. Through a partially open door, she glimpsed Taylor working while Margaret berated her. The former housemaid's eyes welled with tears as she hurried away, powerless to help the child she'd cared for since infancy. By 7:30, Jeremy's car pulled into the circular driveway. Exhaustion lined his face as he entered the silent mansion. Vivian greeted him with a kiss, her red silk dress rustling as she took his briefcase. "Taylor's already in bed," she informed him sweetly. "Poor thing was so tired from playing all day." Jeremy nodded absently, loosening his tie as he climbed the stairs to his daughter's room. Pausing outside her door, he heard the unmistakable sound of muffled sobs. His hand hovered over the doorknob, torn between entering and respecting what he assumed was a child's momentary sadness. "She's probably just overtired," he reasoned to himself, remembering his own childhood tantrums. "I shouldn't coddle her too much." Still, his heart ached as he stood there, listening to Taylor's quiet weeping. After several minutes, he turned away, convincing himself that she needed to learn resilience. The CEO of Coleman Motors, who commanded hundreds of employees and made million-dollar decisions daily, walked away from his daughter's door, leaving Taylor alone with her tears and the growing darkness. The morning sun streamed through the mansion's tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Jeremy Coleman kissed his daughter's forehead, his expensive watch glinting as he checked the time. "I'll be back for dinner, sweetheart," he promised Taylor, his voice warm but distracted. "Be good for Vivian today." Taylor nodded silently, her small fingers clutching the hem of her dress. The little girl watched her father's car disappear down the driveway, taking with it her only protection. The change was immediate. Vivian's smile vanished the moment the front door closed. She snapped her fingers at Taylor, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Enough standing around. The floors need cleaning, all of them." Margaret emerged from the kitchen, her face pinched with disdain. "Children these days have no concept of work," she muttered, crossing her arms. "When Vivian was your age, she knew how to earn her keep." Taylor was handed a mop nearly twice her height and a heavy bucket filled with soapy water. The child struggled to drag it across the entrance hall, her thin arms straining with the effort. "Faster!" Vivian commanded from the sofa, flipping through a magazine without looking up. "We don't have all day." "And don't miss the corners," Margaret added, following behind Taylor and pointing at spots the girl had supposedly missed. Useless child. For 3 hours, Taylor worked without rest. Her palms grew red and raw from gripping the wooden handle. Sweat plastered her blonde hair to her forehead as she moved from room to room, the bucket becoming heavier with each passing minute. "My arms hurt," she whispered, but neither woman acknowledged her plea. In the dining room, disaster struck. Taylor's small foot slipped on the wet marble. She fell hard, the mop clattering beside her as she landed on her elbow. A sharp pain shot through her arm, and a thin line of blood appeared on her pale skin. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at Vivian and Margaret. "I fell," she whimpered, holding out her scraped arm. Vivian rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please, it's barely a scratch." "In my day," Margaret scoffed, "children didn't cry over nothing. Get up and finish your work." "But it hurts," Taylor whispered, a tear sliding down her cheek. Vivian set down her wineglass with a sharp clink. "Do you think your father built his company by crying every time something was difficult? Stop the theatrics and finish the floors." Taylor struggled to her feet, biting her lip to stop the tears. She picked up the mop with trembling hands and continued working, the scratch on her arm stinging with every movement. Neither woman offered a bandage or comfort, only impatient glances and cruel remarks as the little girl worked through her pain. Jeremy Coleman glanced in the rearview mirror as he drove Taylor to school that afternoon. The sunlight streaming through the car window illuminated something concerning on his daughter's small wrist. Angry red marks and a fresh scratch that hadn't been there the day before. His heart tightened in his chest. "Taylor, sweetheart, what happened to your arm?" he asked, his voice gentle but tinged with worry. The 6-year-old instinctively pulled her sleeve down, her eyes immediately filling with tears. "I just fell, Daddy," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor of the automobile. "It was an accident." Jeremy frowned, unconvinced. There was something in her voice, a tremor of fear that seemed out of proportion for a simple fall. He opened his mouth to press further when Vivian, who had insisted on joining them for the school run, quickly intervened from the passenger seat. "Jeremy, don't make such a fuss," his wife said with a light laugh, reaching back to pat Taylor's knee. The child flinched almost imperceptibly at the touch. "Kids fall all the time. Remember how clumsy I told you she was yesterday? She tripped over that rug in the living room." The CEO of Coleman Motors tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. Something about the explanation felt rehearsed, too convenient. He caught Taylor's reflection again, the way she curled into herself, clutching her backpack against her chest like a shield. "Is that what happened, Taylor?" he asked, meeting his daughter's eyes in the mirror. Taylor glanced nervously at Vivian, then back to her father. She gave a tiny nod, but her eyes told a different story, one of fear and silent pleading. "See, nothing to worry about," Vivian assured him, her voice honey-sweet. She turned to face forward again, checking her appearance in the visor mirror. "You're always so overprotective, darling." As they pulled up to the school, Jeremy watched Taylor climb out slowly, her movements careful, as if she were hiding more pain than just the visible marks on her wrist. He called out to her before she walked away. "I'll pick you up myself this afternoon, okay?" The child's face brightened momentarily, a flicker of hope crossing her features before she nodded and turned toward the school building. On the drive back to the mansion, Jeremy remained silent, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The businessman who could solve any corporate crisis felt helpless in the face of his daughter's distress. There was something happening in his home, something that made Taylor's eyes fill with fear instead of joy. The worries that had been gathering like storm clouds in his mind grew darker and heavier, yet remained unspoken as he drove, Vivian chatting pleasantly beside him as if nothing were wrong. As night fell over the Coleman mansion, 6-year-old Taylor Coleman sat cross-legged on her bed, the plush teddy bear, her mother Emma's last gift, clutched tightly to her chest. The bear's worn fur was damp with tears, its button eyes reflecting the dim glow of her bedside lamp. With trembling fingers, she pulled a crumpled piece of paper from beneath her pillow. "I have to be brave," she whispered to the stuffed animal, her voice barely audible in the vast bedroom filled with expensive toys that brought her no joy. Taylor glanced nervously at her bedroom door before scribbling 5 desperate words on the paper. "Daddy, I'm scared of Mom." The little girl's hands shook as she carefully opened a small hidden seam at the back of the teddy bear. She had discovered this secret compartment weeks ago when one of the stitches had come loose during Vivian's first punishment. Now it served as her only safe place. "You're my only friend," Taylor murmured, gently tucking the note inside the bear's stuffing. "You must never tell our secret, okay? Promise me." She pressed her forehead against the toy's worn face, imagining it nodding in silent agreement. As she carefully stitched the seam closed with a plastic children's needle, the floorboards in the hallway creaked. Taylor froze, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Margaret's severe silhouette appeared in the doorway, her dyed hair still perfectly pinned despite the late hour. "What are you doing? Still awake?" the elderly woman demanded, eyes narrowing at the sight of the child huddled on the bed. "Just talking to my teddy," Taylor replied softly, instinctively pulling the stuffed animal closer. Margaret scoffed, her wrinkled face twisting with disdain. "Always playing the pitiful orphan, aren't you? Your father may fall for those sad eyes, but I see right through you." She gestured dismissively at the bear. "That ratty thing should have been thrown away long ago. Only weak children need comfort objects." The older woman turned to leave, her final words floating back like poison. "Tomorrow you'll clean the bathrooms, all of them. Perhaps that will give you something real to cry about." The door closed with a decisive click, leaving Taylor alone once more. She curled around her teddy bear, her small body shaking with silent sobs. Outside her window, the moon cast long shadows across the manicured lawn of the estate. Well inside, the mansion remained silent and cold, indifferent to the child's suffering. No one heard her whispered prayers for rescue. No one saw the tears that eventually lulled her into fitful sleep. The teddy bear alone kept her secret, pressed against her heart like a fragile promise of someday being heard. The cold morning air bit at Maria Lopez's fingers as she gripped the wrought iron fence surrounding the Coleman mansion. She had walked 2 miles from her small apartment just to catch a glimpse of Taylor. The former housemaid's heart sank as she spotted the little girl through the ornate bars, on her knees scrubbing the marble patio with a brush nearly as big as her small hands. "Dios mío," Maria whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the autumn air. For 3 years she had cared for Taylor, bathing her, reading bedtime stories, and holding her when nightmares came after Emma's death. The bond they shared had been real, until Vivian arrived. "We need our privacy as a new family," Vivian had announced with a practiced smile, handing Maria her final paycheck. Jeremy, distracted by a business call, had merely nodded in agreement, not seeing the tears in Taylor's eyes or the calculating gleam in his new wife's. Now, watching the 6-year-old struggling with chores no child should bear, Maria felt rage and helplessness collide in her chest. Taylor's thin arms trembled with exhaustion as she dipped the brush into a bucket of soapy water. Even from this distance, Maria could see the girl's reddened hands and slumped shoulders. "You missed a spot, you useless child." Margaret's voice carried across the garden as she emerged onto the patio, pointing imperiously at the ground. Taylor flinched visibly, then scrubbed harder, her small body tensing with fear. Maria's fingers tightened around the metal bars until her knuckles whitened. "This is not right," she muttered, wiping away angry tears. Mr. Coleman would never allow this if he knew. But Jeremy Coleman was rarely home, consumed by his automotive empire while his daughter suffered. Maria had tried calling the mansion twice, but Vivian had answered both times, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she claimed Taylor was just fine and too busy playing to come to the phone. When Taylor looked up briefly, Maria ducked behind a hedge, not wanting to cause trouble for the child if she were seen. The girl's face, once bright with laughter, now carried shadows no 6-year-old should know. Her eyes, so like Emma's, seemed to have lost their sparkle. "I should have fought harder to stay," Maria whispered, guilt washing over her. She had considered calling child services, but without proof, and against a man of Jeremy's wealth and influence, what could she do? With a heavy heart, Maria turned away from the fence, unable to watch any longer. "I'll find a way to help you, pequeña," she promised the air, her determination hardening with each step. The former housemaid walked away from the mansion, her mind racing with possibilities, her soul aching for the little girl who had become like a daughter to her. The morning sunlight streamed through the mansion windows as Vivian and Margaret huddled in the living room, whispering over cups of imported tea. Their latest beauty obsession had become raw honey masks, which they claimed kept their skin youthful and radiant. The organic honey from that hive in the garden would be perfect, Margaret said, her wrinkled fingers tapping against the porcelain cup. Those worker bees collect pollen from the rarest flowers. Vivian's eyes gleamed with malice. "And I know exactly who can get it for us." She glanced toward the kitchen, where Taylor was silently washing dishes, her small hands barely able to reach the sink. Later that afternoon, Vivian called Taylor into the garden. The 6-year-old approached cautiously, her eyes downcast, as she stood before her stepmother and Margaret. The older woman watched with cold amusement, as Vivian pointed to an oak tree, where a large beehive hung from a branch nearly 15 feet off the ground. "We need fresh honey for our beauty treatments," Vivian announced, handing Taylor a glass jar. "Climb up there and fill this." Taylor's eyes widened with terror. "But the bees will sting me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Margaret scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. They won't bother you if you're quick." "I don't know how to," Taylor began, but Vivian cut her off. "Your father will be very disappointed when he hears you've been disobedient again," she threatened, her voice honeyed with false concern. "And you know what happens to disobedient little girls, don't you?" The child's shoulders slumped in defeat. She knew exactly what would happen. No dinner, locked in her room, more chores tomorrow. With trembling hands, Taylor took the jar and approached the tree. The rough bark scraped her palms as she struggled to climb. The jar tucked awkwardly into her dress pocket. Each branch seemed impossibly far from the next, but the fear of punishment drove her upward. The buzzing grew louder as she neared the hive, a terrifying symphony that made her heart pound. "Hurry up!" Margaret called from below, impatience sharp in her voice. Taylor reached for the hive, tears blurring her vision. The moment her fingers brushed against it, the bees erupted in fury. They swarmed around her, their stingers finding her exposed skin, arms, neck, face. She screamed, dropping the jar as pain exploded across her body. In blind panic, Taylor lost her grip. The world tilted sickeningly as she fell, branches scraping her skin on the way down. The last thing she saw was Vivian's shocked face as her small body hit the ground with a terrible thud, consciousness slipping away as the angry bees continued their assault on her motionless form. Jeremy Coleman's tires screeched against the driveway as he pulled up to the mansion, his mind still occupied with production issues at the factory. The sound that greeted him, however, instantly shattered his business concerns. A weak, pitiful cry coming from the garden. He rushed toward the sound, his heart pounding. "Taylor!" he shouted, finding his daughter collapsed on the grass beneath the old oak tree. Her tiny body was swollen with angry red welts, her breathing shallow and labored. A broken honeycomb lay beside her. Jeremy scooped his daughter into his arms, her skin burning with fever. "What happened?" he demanded, looking wildly at Vivian, who stood nearby with a horrified expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The bees! She was playing and disturbed them," Vivian stammered, her perfectly manicured hand covering her mouth. There was no time for questions. Jeremy raced to his vehicle, gently placing Taylor in the back seat. "Hold on, sweetheart," he whispered, speeding toward the hospital, every second stretching into eternity as his daughter's breathing grew more labored. At the emergency entrance, medical staff rushed Taylor inside. Jeremy paced the waiting room, his expensive suit rumpled, his face ashen with worry. After what seemed like hours, Dr. Susan Miller emerged, her expression grave. "Mr. Coleman, your daughter is stabilized, but I'm concerned about more than just the bee stings," she said quietly, leading him to a private consultation room. "Taylor shows signs of malnutrition. She's underweight for her age, and there are healing bruises on her arms and back that predate today's incident." Jeremy felt the floor shift beneath him. "What are you saying?" "These aren't normal childhood injuries," Dr. Miller continued, her voice gentle but firm. "There's a pattern consistent with ongoing physical stress, and emotionally, she's withdrawn in a way that concerns me." The CEO of Coleman Motors sat stunned, memories flooding back. Taylor's quietness, her flinching at sudden movements, the scratch he'd noticed days ago. When he returned to Taylor's room, she lay sleeping, looking impossibly small among the white sheets and monitoring equipment. Jeremy touched her hand gently, noticing the raw skin and calluses no 6-year-old should have. Later that evening, when Vivian arrived at the hospital, Jeremy confronted her in the hallway. "Tell me the truth about what's been happening to my daughter," he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Vivian's eyes widened with practiced innocence. "Jeremy, you can't possibly think—" "Stop," he cut her off, his voice trembling with rage. "I saw the honeycomb. Why was my daughter anywhere near a beehive?" Tears filled Vivian's eyes. "You're overreacting. Children get hurt." But something had finally broken in Jeremy. The blinders he'd worn for months had fallen away, and he could no longer ignore what had been happening right under his roof. Maria Lopez stood nervously in the hospital corridor, her weathered hands clutching her purse as she approached Jeremy Coleman. The former housemaid had been watching the mansion from afar since Vivian had dismissed her, and what she had witnessed had kept her awake for months. "Mr. Coleman," she began, her voice trembling, "I've been trying to reach you for weeks." The CEO looked up, his eyes red-rimmed from hours of waiting while doctors treated Taylor's bee stings. Maria couldn't hold back any longer. "Your daughter has been suffering terribly," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Vivian makes her scrub floors until her hands bleed. She forces Taylor to wash her feet, clean the bathrooms, even serve her and Margaret like a servant." Jeremy's face drained of color as Maria continued, describing how the little girl was denied meals when chores weren't completed to Vivian's impossible standards. How Margaret would mock Taylor's tears, calling her weak and worthless. How the child was forced to stand in corners for hours when she made the slightest noise. "They wait until you leave," Maria explained, her voice breaking. "The moment your car pulls away, they transform. I've seen Taylor carrying buckets of water twice her weight. I've heard her crying through the garden windows." The father's hands began to shake as memories flooded back, Unexplained bruises Taylor claimed came from falling. Her flinching when Vivian moved too quickly. Her silence at dinner tables. The way his daughter's eyes had lost their sparkle over the past 6 months. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Jeremy asked, his voice barely audible. "I tried calling your office," Maria replied. "But your secretary, she's Vivian's friend Cheryl, she never put me through. I wrote letters that were probably intercepted. When I came to the gate once, Margaret threatened to call the police." Dr. Susan Miller approached them, medical chart in hand. "Mr. Coleman, we found evidence of previous injuries, some weeks old. There's also mild malnutrition and signs of psychological distress consistent with ongoing abuse." Jeremy collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. How could he have been so blind? His precious daughter, Emma's child, suffering while he buried himself in work, thinking luxury could replace his presence. "I should have seen it," he whispered. "All the signs were there." Rising to his feet, Jeremy's grief transformed into determination. He placed a hand on Maria's shoulder. "Thank you for your courage. Taylor will never spend another moment with those monsters." His jaw set firmly as he looked toward his daughter's room. "I promise you, Maria, and I promise Taylor, I will protect her with everything I have. This ends today." Jeremy Coleman arrived home unannounced, his footsteps silent as he entered through the side door. The sound of his daughter's whimpers led him to the kitchen where he froze in horror. Taylor was balanced precariously on a step stool, her tiny arms trembling as she scrubbed the highest cabinet shelves while Margaret barked orders from below. "Higher! You missed a spot," the elderly woman snapped, jabbing a bony finger upward. Beside her, Vivian lounged against the counter, scrolling through her smartphone with manicured nails, occasionally glancing up to add her own criticism. "I told you to be done before your father gets home," Vivian hissed. "Useless child." Something inside Jeremy shattered. The businessman who prided himself on cool negotiation felt white-hot rage surge through his veins. "Get away from my daughter," he commanded, his voice dangerously low. Both women spun around, their faces transforming instantly. Vivian's cruel smile melted into practiced innocence. "Jeremy, you're early," she cooed, stepping toward him. "We were just teaching Taylor some responsibility." "Pack your things, both of you, out, now." Each word fell like a hammer. Margaret puffed up indignantly. "You can't possibly—" "I said out," Jeremy roared, rushing to lift Taylor from the stool. The child clung to him, burying her face in his neck, her small body shaking with silent sobs. Vivian's mask crumbled, revealing the ugliness beneath. "You'll regret this," she spat. "I'm entitled to half of everything you own." Jeremy held Taylor closer. "Try it. I have security footage of every room installed last week. Every moment of abuse is documented." The color drained from both women's faces. Within an hour, the mansion staff, many who had secretly despised Vivian's treatment of Taylor, eagerly packed the women's belongings. Security escorted them out, Vivian's threats echoing across the driveway as they departed. That night, Jeremy sat beside Taylor's bed, watching her sleep. Her arms bore faint bruises, her small hands raw from cleaning chemicals. How had he been so blind? The weight of his failure crushed him as he gently stroked her hair. "I promise, Taylor," he whispered. "No one will ever hurt you again." The next morning, Jeremy made calls from his home office. By afternoon, Linda Perez arrived, a compassionate private nurse with experience in childhood trauma. The woman's gentle manner immediately put Taylor at ease. "We'll take it one day at a time," Linda assured Jeremy as Taylor cautiously showed her the teddy bear that had been her only confidant. Jeremy nodded, watching his daughter. Coleman Motors could wait. For the first time since Emma's death, he understood what truly mattered. His empire meant nothing if he couldn't protect the one person who gave it purpose. The morning sun filtered through Taylor's bedroom window as Linda Perez gently applied ointment to the last of the bee stings. The child's physical wounds were healing faster than the invisible ones. Maria Lopez bustled around the room, arranging fresh flowers and speaking softly in Spanish, little prayers of protection that made Taylor smile for the first time in weeks. "You're getting stronger every day, pequeña," Maria said, smoothing Taylor's hair. The former housemaid had returned to the Coleman household the moment Jeremy had called, leaving her new job without hesitation. Meanwhile, across town, Jeremy Coleman sat in his office at Coleman Motors, staring at legal documents that threatened everything he'd built. Rumors had spread through the automotive industry like wildfire, whispers of family scandal and instability. Several investors had already pulled out, sending stock prices tumbling. "Mr. Coleman?" His assistant knocked softly. "Mr. Grant is on line too." Jeremy's jaw tightened. Stephen had been his trusted lawyer for 8 years, but now the man was representing Vivian in what promised to be a vicious divorce battle. The betrayal cut deep. In a dimly lit apartment across town, Vivian paced while her mother Margaret watched with cold calculation. Stephen Grant sat at the dining table, legal papers spread before him. "We'll destroy him," Vivian hissed, her manicured nails tapping against her smartphone. "He humiliated me, threw us out like garbage." Margaret nodded, her severe expression unchanged. "He'll regret crossing us." Stephen adjusted his tie. "I know every weakness in his company. With the right pressure, Coleman Motors will collapse, and the settlement will be substantial." Vivian smiled thinly and sent a message to her friend Cheryl. "It's time. He'll pay for everything." That afternoon, Jeremy left work early, something he'd never done before Taylor's hospitalization. He picked up his daughter and drove her to the car plant, her tiny hand in his as they walked the assembly line. "This will all be yours someday," he told her, lifting her up to see a sleek vehicle taking shape. Taylor's eyes widened with wonder, not at the machinery or wealth, but at the simple joy of having her father's undivided attention. That evening, as they planted flowers in the mansion's garden, Jeremy watched Taylor laugh as butterflies landed on the blooms. For a moment, peace seemed possible, but behind the high walls of their estate, in the shadows beyond security cameras, danger was gathering. Vivian's plan was already in motion, and Jeremy's newfound happiness with his daughter had made him vulnerable in ways he couldn't imagine. The evening had been peaceful, a rare moment of tranquility in the garden behind the Coleman mansion. Taylor sat cross-legged on the grass, her teddy bear tucked under one arm as she helped Maria plant new flowers. The scent of jasmine hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, the little girl's laughter echoed across the property. "Look, Maria, this one has purple spots," Taylor exclaimed, holding up a small bloom. Maria Lopez smiled warmly, about to respond when the sound of twigs snapping caught her attention. Before she could react, 3 masked figures emerged from the shadows, moving with terrifying purpose. "Taylor, run!" Maria screamed, lunging forward to protect the child. One intruder shoved the former housemaid roughly to the ground, while another scooped Taylor into his arms. The little girl's terrified screams pierced the night as she kicked and struggled, her teddy bear falling forgotten onto the damp earth. "Daddy! Maria, help me!" Taylor's desperate cries grew fainter as the kidnappers carried her toward a waiting vehicle. Maria fought fiercely, clawing at one attacker's face and drawing blood before being struck hard enough to collapse. She watched helplessly as the car's taillights disappeared down the long driveway. Taylor's small hand pressed against the rear window. Inside the mansion, Jeremy Coleman was reviewing documents when the sound of Maria's frantic pounding at his study door made his blood run cold. Her face was bruised, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They took her! They took Taylor!" The words barely registered before Jeremy's phone rang. He answered with trembling hands, his entire world collapsing as Vivian's cold voice filled his ear. "Hello, Jeremy. Missing something precious?" The CEO gripped the desk to stay upright. "Where is she? If you've heard her, Taylor's fine." "For now," Vivian interrupted. "But her future depends entirely on you. Sign over Coleman Motors and all your properties to me by tomorrow morning, or you'll never see your daughter again." In the background, Jeremy could hear Taylor's muffled sobs. The sound shattered what remained of his composure. "Let me speak to her," he demanded, voice breaking. "Daddy?" Taylor's terrified voice came through. "I'm scared. I'm coming for you, sweetheart," Jeremy promised before Vivian took back the phone. "Tick-tock, Jeremy. Involve the police, and this ends badly." The line went dead. Jeremy stood frozen for only a moment before turning to Maria. "Call Detective Miller," he ordered, already grabbing his car keys. "Tell him everything." As he rushed toward the door, Jeremy's face hardened with determination. "I'll find her if I have to tear this city apart brick by brick." Detective Robert Miller barked orders into his radio as rain pelted the windshield of the police cruiser. "All units converge on the warehouse district. Suspect vehicle identified." His weathered face showed the determination of a man who'd seen too many children in danger. Jeremy Coleman sat beside him, knuckles white as he gripped the door handle. The father hadn't slept since Taylor's kidnapping, his eyes bloodshot and wild with fear. "If they've hurt her," he whispered, unable to finish the thought. Inside the abandoned warehouse, Taylor sat trembling on a metal chair, her tiny wrists bound with zip ties. Tears streaked her dirt-smudged face as Vivian paced before her, red heels clicking against concrete. "Your daddy will be here soon," Vivian sneered, checking her watch. "And then we'll see how much he really loves his precious little girl." Margaret stood in the corner, her severe expression illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning through the high windows. "He'll sign," she said confidently. "A man like him always chooses family over fortune." Stephen Grant spread legal documents across a makeshift table, adjusting his tie. "Once he signs these, Coleman Motors and all assets transfer to Vivian, perfectly legal under duress." The lawyer smirked, patting the inside pocket of his jacket where a knife rested. Taylor whimpered, her voice barely audible. "My daddy will come." "Oh, he'll come," Vivian laughed coldly, "but he'll leave with nothing but you." Headlights swept across the warehouse walls as Jeremy's car pulled up outside. The businessman entered alone, soaked from the downpour, his eyes immediately finding his daughter. "Taylor," he called, starting forward before Stephen blocked his path. "The documents first," the lawyer demanded, producing a pen. Jeremy's hand shook as he signed page after page, never taking his eyes off Taylor. "Let her go now." Vivian snatched the papers, checking each signature. "It's done," she announced triumphantly. As Stephen moved to untie Taylor, his expression changed. In one fluid motion, he pulled out his knife, grabbing the child. "Insurance," he hissed. "Until we're safely away." The warehouse doors burst open. "Police, drop your weapons!" Detective Miller shouted as officers swarmed in. Stephen lunged with the knife as Jeremy threw himself forward, shielding Taylor. The blade sliced across his back as they fell to the floor. "Day!" Taylor screamed as officers tackled Stephen to the ground. Vivian and Margaret were forced against the wall, handcuffed amid their protests and threats. Outside, thunder crashed as Detective Miller cut Taylor's bonds. The little girl wrapped her arms around her father, who winced through his pain to hold her close. "It's over," Jeremy whispered, blood seeping through his shirt. "You're safe now. I'm never letting you go again." As paramedics rushed in, the storm raged on. But inside, for the first time in too long, Taylor felt truly protected in her father's embrace. The courtroom fell silent as Taylor Coleman took the stand, her small frame barely visible behind the witness box. Her voice, though soft, carried strength as she recounted the months of abuse. Jeremy watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak, amazed by her courage. The evidence was overwhelming. Maria Lopez's testimony, hospital records, and security footage from the mansion left no room for doubt. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Vivian and her mother Margaret received lengthy sentences for child abuse and kidnapping. Stephen Grant, once a trusted lawyer, faced additional charges for conspiracy and attempted extortion. Cheryl, who had helped coordinate the kidnapping, received a lesser sentence in exchange for her testimony. Even Dr. Reynolds, who had ignored Taylor's obvious signs of abuse during routine checkups, lost his medical license and faced professional sanctions. As they left the courthouse, Taylor looked up at her father. "Is it really over now?" she asked, her eyes still carrying traces of fear. "Yes, sweetheart," Jeremy assured her, kneeling to her level. "They can never hurt you again." The healing process was slow but steady. Jeremy hired the best child psychologist in the city, who helped Taylor process her trauma through art therapy and play. The businessman who once spent 16-hour days at the factory now arranged his schedule around his daughter's needs. Maria returned to work at the mansion, this time as Taylor's nanny, bringing warmth back to the cold halls. Linda Perez continued visiting 3 times weekly until Taylor's physical wounds had completely healed. One spring afternoon, Jeremy came home early to find Taylor and Maria planting flowers in the garden, the same spot where she had once been forced to gather honey. "Daddy, look," Taylor called, her smile genuine for the first time in months. "We're making the garden pretty again." Jeremy joined them, getting his expensive suit dirty as they dug in the soil together. That night, they ate dinner at the kitchen table rather than the formal dining room, laughing as they made pizza together. The Coleman Motors empire continued to thrive, but Jeremy's priorities had fundamentally shifted. He installed a small office at home and brought Taylor to the factory on special days, introducing her to the employees who greeted her with kindness. As months passed, the nightmares became less frequent. The mansion, once a place of fear, slowly transformed into a true home. Father and daughter built new traditions together: Sunday picnics, bedtime stories, and weekend drives in classic cars from the factory collection. Their journey proved that even after the darkest storms, healing was possible, not through wealth or power, but through love, presence, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his daughter.